The Occupy Gezi protests continue, now in their fourth day, the protest expanding outside of Istanbul and now spreading across most of Turkey. If you're not familiar with the Occupy Gezi protests, I'm not surprised. It's not getting much mainstream coverage in America, and it's getting almost no coverage whatsoever in Turkey. That's one of the reasons I think it's important to focus on it. Now, thanks to Twitter and other social media outlets, we are getting some information about what's been happening, but so far, probably because of government pressure, information through Turkish news has been almost non-existent. So, let me get you up to date with what's been happening by going over a quick timeline of the Occupy Gezi protests. Now, it started just a couple of days ago on the 28th. There was a planned demolition of the Taksim Gezi Park and Square. Now, this was a green area, I guess. It had trees, it had a park, and it was going to be demolished to make way for several buildings, including a planned mall. Now, thanks to, on the 28th, about 50 protesters showing up, they were able to stop the walls around the park from being demolished. Now, eventually, those would be demolished when the police intervened. And then by the 29th, one day later, there was a lot more, there were bigger crowds that were developing. Some local celebrities had shown up. They did a press conference. They showed films there to try to rally support. And on into the 29th, the protests were just gaining speed, I guess. This also happened on the 30th. Now, at this point, because of the inability of the planned demolition to go ahead, the police started to amp up their response to the protests. And on the 31st, when crowds had started to number in the hundreds, we did have our first outbreak of violence. Now, up until this point, the protesters are saying that they're protesting in incredibly, totally non-violent fashion. But the police did strike out with tear gas, water cannons, pepper spray, and things of that sort. At least 100 were injured. There were scuffles between protesters and the police, actual fights breaking out, and not just these crowd control measures. And now, at this point on the 31st, we're talking about just yesterday, by the way, the protests had moved outside of just Istanbul. Satellite protests had started around Turkey. Crowds in some places reported up to 10,000 people in size. And mass imprisonments had also begun. Just in Istanbul, just at the actual, the Gezi protest, at least 60 were arrested in one move. Now, that's the basic timeline. As I've said, these protests have spread throughout Turkey. We're finally getting some coverage in the American media. Now, the Turkish media still is not talking about it much, and the theory is that the Turkish government is putting a lot of pressure on them. And so you have a very interesting disconnect inside of Turkey, where it's one of the most popular, most fiery subjects, I guess, being talked about on Twitter, but you turn to the actual news and you see almost nothing, despite the fact that you can look out your window and see protests in many different cities, many different towns. Now, both the U.S. government and the Turkish government have released statements. First, the Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said, wherever you go in the world, in places like this, governments would take measures, referring to what some perceive to be a heavy-handed response to the nonviolent protests. And just on Saturday, actually just earlier today, he called for an immediate end to the protests. Not entirely surprised by that. The U.S. government is... I guess they're being a little bit cautious, but they are giving at least some support to the protesters. We have a statement from the United States State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki. She says, "We believe that Turkey's long-term stability, security, and prosperity is best guaranteed by upholding the fundamental freedoms of expression, assembly, and association, which is what it seems these individuals were doing." Now, if you haven't heard more about these protests before, you might wonder why, just because of the demolition of this park, the protests would expand in the way that they have. Well, it's not called Occupy Gezi just because that's the new in thing, that's the new meme. The actual nature of the protests has followed a similar trajectory as the Occupy Wall Street protests did in America. Now, originally, it was a mostly environmental, urban planning sort of protest. They didn't like the space being taken away. But steadily, that has grown to include other grievances against the government. Now, if you know anything about Turkish politics, you know that historically it has been, especially in that region, an incredibly secular government. But steadily over the past few years, over the last decade, there has been a greater influx of Islamic influence over the government. And you've seen that reflected in policies in Turkey. Now, there have been some silly policies, I think, that I can totally understand them opposing, such as bans on public displays of affection, limitations on how much alcohol can be consumed and sold, infringements on free speech and things like that. And so you see the growth of not just government power, but specifically the Islamic influence in government power increasing in Turkey today. And so now what started as a purely environmental protest has grown to include a number of different grievances against different aspects of Turkish society and government, similar to how the Occupy protests expanded over time in America. Now, we're only 4 days into these protests, and especially as an outsider, it's impossible for me to really speculate as to what will happen. We've seen some, I guess, counterforce from the police. There has been, as we said, a number of injuries, a number of arrests. There has not yet been any deaths, thankfully. And when you're talking about protests numbering in the hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands, that actually in the modern day is, I think, a silver lining on what's going on there. Now, from what I've learned about the Occupy Gezi protests, my word of advice would be that while it seemed at first in America that the disparate nature, the lacking in central leadership nature of the Occupy Wall Street protests would be a strength in the long run, it did make it incredibly easy for the mainstream media to marginalize these people as lacking a central message, a central mission. I don't know that that will be replicated in Turkey today, but it is a concern for those who want these protests to have some lingering impact on Turkish government. Now, I don't know if they will be able to I guess, organize around a single message, since as yet, as I said, there are a number of disparate issues that are being worked on. But we will be keeping you apprised. This is the first episode of our show that has happened during these protests. I expect that, considering, I guess, how they've swept across Turkey like political wildfire, they will still be around next week, and so I'll update you then. As of now, because the protesters have not engaged in any sort of violent protests against the government, I wish them the best, and we will keep you apprised.